Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Sookyung Oh. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really glad to be here with you all today. I thought before I jump into an introduction about our organization, it might help you all to have a little bit of context about Asian American communities in Virginia. So I hope you will indulge me in a short game of true and false. Um, and how we can play this is I'm gonna share a couple things on the screen, and you can just write in the chat what you think the answer is. Okay, there's no prize or anything, and it really is for fun, and we'll have a short discussion afterwards. So, just some agreements. I hope you don't mind if I share this, right? If take space, make space. I'd love to hear from you. So whether that's through the chat or, however you all do it. But at the same time, if you are someone who talks a lot, maybe you might want to consider, um, letting other people speak too. I will do my best to avoid jargon and acronyms. It happens a lot. Let's lean into discomfort. There may be information that I share that is uncomfortable for you. You may share information that's uncomfortable for me. I'd prefer that we try to be honest with each other. And if that means being a little uncomfortable rather than not dialoguing at all, because we want to avoid discomfort. Let's have one person speak at a time if that's how you do things. Sounds like you do a lot of chat, so that might not be an issue. And I hope that this is not that we'll be sharing much confidential information, but if we do, that that stays here, but whatever ideas you get, that's what you can share out to the world. Okay. All right. Well, if there's no objection, and I'm also looking at the chat. So if there are no objections, I will begin. Okay. So let's start true or false. So true or false, Asian Americans are the fastest growing community of color in the United States. True or false? Start writing your answers in the chat. Okay. Seeing a couple of, okay, yeah, okay, different answers. I know I was trying to do this, like, I don't know if any of you listen to NPR, the like wait, don't tell me. Like I was trying to do like a limericks game show, and so I just couldn't, but I'm not creative enough to do that. So I only went with true and false. Okay, so we got a couple truths, a couple falses. Let's see what the answer is. Da da da. The answer is true. Asian Americans between 2000 and 2019 grew 81%. Currently, the Asian American population is around 22 million. Now, you may go, okay, that's fine, but what about the rest of Virginia? So here's a very crudely drawn chart I made looking at comparing 2010 American Community Survey data with 2020. And as you can see, overall there was population growth among all racial groups. I will explain why Hispanic is not on here briefly, which is, it's like I just don't have enough time to really explain this, but, you could, Latino or Hispanic can be something that any race group can claim. So it's actually like really difficult to sometimes back out Latino data as its own race. So I'm just using the racial categories that the Census Bureau uses. But in any case, as you can see, Asian Americans in Virginia, the population growth was 37% compared to, say, 3% for white, 6% for Black, and 19% other, 5% Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. Okay, next, true and false. Most Asian Americans are born in the United States. What do you think? Okay. Do. All right, let's look at this. The answer is false. 57% of Asian Americans, including 71% of Asian Americans, Asian American adults, were actually born in another country. I actually was born in Philadelphia, so I'm not part of that. But my parents certainly immigrated from South Korea. I think there are a lot of different factors for this, and we'll go into this a little bit further. And certainly one of the watershed pieces of legislation that led to so much migration of Asian Americans to the U.S. was the 1965 Immigration Act. Another one was, the Vietnam War, right, which prompted the resettlement of hundreds of thousands of refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And, Asian Americans came to the U.S. in so many different ways. So, for example, you look at Japanese Americans, 27% of Japanese Americans as of today are foreign born. But you can also see that their immigration patterns, they came very early, right? 19th century as sugar plantation workers in Hawaii before U.S. colonization of Hawaii. But if you look at Bhutanese Americans, 85% are foreign born, and that's because they're more of a recent refugee population.
We have a question here.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
When you say Asian, what are you including? Does that include any of the Middle East? Is it Southeast, Central Asia?
I think that's such a wonderful question, David. There is going to be, depending on who you talk to, some organizations that work with Asian American communities would include the Middle East, right? At Hamkae Center, when we say Asian American, we're talking about like East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islanders. We generally do not count Middle East. We've worked with many different communities of color, and again, there's no right or wrong here. I think it's a little bit of also political distinction as well. But what some Middle Eastern American communities have said is that they feel like their experiences are they're very different from East Asian, Southeast Asian, and South Asian. And so they would prefer to maybe be differently categorized, like say Arab and Middle Eastern American, you know what I'm saying? And sometimes even different South Asian communities may want to be part of that, may find themselves finding more home using that type of labeling. So thank you for bringing that up, David. I think that's a great question. But for other people, if they use Asian American, like in the census, they often mean that entire swath, including the Middle East. Okay, and just for your, in Virginia, 66% of Asian Americans are foreign born. Okay, and consequently, what we see is that there's a lot of different languages spoken by. At Hamkae Center, we actually prefer the term linguistically marginalized, but the more common term I think folks use is limited English proficient. So as you can see, the top languages besides Spanish are actually Asian languages, right? Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Hindi. Okay, I'm sharing this context because hopefully it will explain why Hamkae Center works on the things we work on. Okay, I'm just gonna actually speed through this because we don't, I want to make sure we make the best use of our time. How about this question? Asian American ethnic groups are equally wealthy and educated. True or false? I feel like some of these questions, the answer is very obvious, but thanks for playing along with me today. All right, so false. Yes, false. So I'm going to start with the obvious that overall, if you look at Asian Americans in the aggregate, Asian Americans do seem to be better off compared to the overall US population, right? For example, the median Asian American household income is close to $86,000 compared to all US households, which is $62,000, right? More than half of Asian Americans have a bachelor's degree versus, you know, a third of the US population. But again, the story looks really different when you break it down by ethnic group. So, I mean, I guess I don't really have to read the read the slide. And and I'm sure my colleagues who work with Indian American communities, they would say, yes, okay, this may be true that in our community the median income household is this high, but obviously that's not going to be the case for all Indian Americans. Obviously it's not going to be the case for all Burmese Americans that their median household income is that low. I think one of the things that we come across a lot doing our work at Hamkae Center is this idea, though, that all Asian Americans are doing really well, and it's all part of what in the Asian American community we call that the model minority myth. Some of you have probably heard this, right? This idea that Asian Americans are doing well, so they don't require any more assistance than other communities. And the history of the model minority myth is very much tied to the rise of the Black leadership and civil rights movement in the US. It was actually a lot of interesting and unfortunate sort of trying to counter actually the civil rights movement by saying, look at this one minority group. Look, they're all causing all this trouble. These Black Americans, they're making a fuss about, right to vote and, having equality. But look at this other minority group. And by the way, that's not a term that I use. I hate that term minority, but I'm just going to use it now because that's the term people use and, some people continue to use. Look at this other minority group, these Asians, right? Like they're not complaining, right? They're keeping their head down, they're working hard, right? Like, why can't, and implicitly it was, why can't Black people be more like Asian people, right? But the problem to this is that obviously the histories of how Black people came to this country and the histories of how Asian people come to this country are like totally different. But still, that model minority myth never went away. So that's kind of why we like to talk about this thing about equally, are Asian Americans all equally wealthy and educated? And actually what's interesting is what the Pew Research Center has found is that if anything, Asian Americans have the largest and fastest growing wealth gap. So within our community, the top 10% of income earners, and then in terms of wealth, so not just like actual cash, but like if you count up all of their dollar signs that are tied up in like property and whatnot, is that gap is the highest between the top 10% and the bottom 10%. Okay. All Asian immigrants in the US are documented, or they're like US citizens or legal permanent residents. True or false? Okay, more chat activity. Okay, again, obviously I want you to answer false here because that is the answer. Actually, in the US, there's about 1.7 million undocumented Asian immigrants, which makes up 16% of the undocumented population. And as you can see here, nationwide, where do undocumented Asian Americans, countries of origin, it's pretty wide: India, China, Philippines, South Korea, Vietnam. Here in Virginia, what we find is that about 19% of undocumented immigrants are from Asia. So a little bit higher than the national. And the top country of origin for undocumented immigrants in Virginia is India, followed by Korea. Okay. All right. So I'd like to just pause here and, see if folks might want to answer this in the chat. If there were any facts that you found surprising and why, or if you found data points that conflict with each other, or, I think I wrote it this way, but I'm just wondering if there were data points that conflict with what you understood to be about the Asian American experience. I'm sure many of you, maybe all of you probably know at least one Asian American. Maybe it was someone you worked with. Maybe it's a friend, right? Maybe it's a family member. So I know we're going to have to keep going and we're not going to be able to spend too much time. We're not going to spend time on your responses, but nevertheless, I'd love to kind of, I always love hearing what people's reactions are to this true and false. There are many more questions I could have asked, but for sake of time, I did not ask all of them. I didn't even include all of them. I do see a question here from Nancy and Pax Baker. Is there a difference in becoming documented depending on country of origin? I guess I will say this. So, there are some countries that are considered, if you're coming from that country and you immigrated here from, during a specific time period, you could have gotten temporary protected status, right? So I'm not going to speak about that. It's about being, undocumented. I know some people use the word illegal, that we don't use that word at Hamkae Center because acts are illegal, not people. I'm not a lawyer, so it's not a legal answer. My answer is I don't think so, right? Like generally, the way it is interesting though that the way Asian Americans, how they become undocumented is slightly, it's fairly different from, say, undocumented immigrants from Mexico or countries south of us, right? Where there is a crossing of the border, obviously, but it's not like literally by foot, right? Some people do cross from Canada, but generally, folks might come here, say, as a tourist, right? But often case, the folks that we work with at Hamkae Center, they came here as students or they came here as workers. And so they were promised by their employer, hey, you work for me for a couple of years, X number of years, I will file paperwork on your behalf to then become a legal permanent resident, right? And then from there, you can then, you're here for 5 years or so, then you can become a citizen. So more often than not, that's actually the undocumented folks we meet are folks who are promised by their employer, by an employer, if you do this, you will become documented, or maybe they come to study here and the school tells them, okay, become a student, then we'll help you get a job, right? And then through your job, you'll be able to convert your immigration status. And that did not always happen. So I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but when I think of the undocumented folks we work with, that's their typical story. I had a coworker from Vietnam many years ago. Okay. I was surprised at how many Asian immigrants. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that generally Afghans, so in this figure, I will say, no, they're not. Right. But then again, it depends on who you talk to. If you will consider Afghani refugees or people from Afghanistan, Asian American or not. I know from this particular data point that Afghans are not, were not considered in this figure. In my figure of the API data, national data about how many are undocumented in the US. I don't actually know about the Migration Policy Institute, like where they put Afghanistan. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. So just a content warning, next section includes engages with historical and contemporary issues of racism, xenophobia, and violence. So we're going to continue doing some true and false. Oops, you already saw the answer. Anti-Asian violence. escalated after the COVID-19 pandemic. True or false? I hope you can see the answer to that. Okay, so we have some truths and we have some false. So it's, the answer to this, I feel like depends on who you talk to. But at Hamkae Center, our answer is false. That in the US, there actually has always been a history of violence against Asian Americans, right? So there could be like more individualized acts, right? So here's simply some examples, right? And then where it's done by a group of people, like like some of the early anti-immigrant political parties that were born in the US were the result of white people certain white people not even supporting Irish immigration into this country, and certainly not Chinese immigration to this country, right? Because for a long time, Irish folks were not even totally considered white the way you might be if you were from like England or something. Anyways, and we also see that there was anti-Asian violence sanctioned by the US government. So maybe it's the Chinese Exclusion Act, maybe it's the Page Act, the incarceration of Japanese Americans, and the Patriot Act. So again, it really, some people would say true, but organizationally, we think that there's actually been a long history of violence against Asian Americans in this country. True or false? Most people committing acts of anti-Asian violence are other people of color. Okay. And the answer to that is yes, it's false. So I like to bring this up because in particular, we have found that whenever like a lot of viral videos that get circulated in the Asian American community usually focus on a Black person attacking an Asian American. But consequently, if you look when race information is available, the 75% of offenders are white men. So I just like to bring this out there because usually videos that get circulated on social media will feature a Black man, but the actual data, like where people report and it's considered a hate crime, the offender is typically a white man. Okay. And lastly, Asian Americans are more likely than other communities of color to be targeted by hate crimes. Yeah, I think the answer to this is really interesting. It's false. So there is a lot in the news, and and certainly having a certain political leaders start using terminology like Kung flu, or calling COVID-19 like the China virus, or it doesn't help. But interestingly enough, looking at 2020 FBI hate crime statistics, and hate crimes are very, the act has to be very specific to be considered a hate crime, but typically more than half still target African Americans, right? So I mean, I share all of this, I'm not, obviously as an Asian American, it's not because I want to downplay, what's happening in our community, but I do like to give some context that, in this country, right, racism, especially as it impacts Black and African American communities, is in a, I mean, I don't want to say worse. It's just, it really is still so true, even though even if we don't see it in the news. And even if what you do see, we do see in the news generally is around attacks, like racially motivated attacks against Asian folks. Obviously the shooting in Buffalo, undermine, you know, is a gruesome and horrific example of that. Okay, so, oh, I don't know what just happened. Why did that just happen? I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a sec because I'm not quite sure why it moved away from the presentation. But I wanted to, okay, it's coming back now. Okay, great. Again, for the chat, was there anything that confirmed your understanding of Asian American experiences during the pandemic? Are there accounts that you've heard? Are there any stories that are new to you? Please feel free to put that in the chat. And I'll be looking at that as I continue the rest of the presentation, which is going to now turn to our organization, Hamkae Center. Oh, and by the way, here's just some more resources that folks can use. And since you get this recording, I won't say these out loud. Okay, so Hamkae Center, what the heck are we? We are a community organization whose mission is to organize Asian Americans for social, racial, and economic justice. We are affiliated with NACASEC, which is a national network of local groups like us. There's affiliates in Texas, New York, and Pennsylvania and Illinois. So we're the Virginia chapter. And our values are to live right, to know our roots, to live strong, and to live together. You can read more about each of these values on our website, which I'll share with you later. I love telling people about our values because I think it really, if you don't know much about us, if you know our values, then you'll understand why we work on what we do. And speaking of which, I'll go into what do you guys work on? So we have 4 main program areas. Our first is around community organizing and grassroots policy advocacy. And here's the issue areas that we are currently working on. I would say the current campaign that we are all focused on right now is around education equity, specifically, and I'm happy to talk with people about this after our presentation today, because I don't think we have time to go over all of it, which is the state of the Commonwealth of Virginia is currently revising the standards of learning, the SOLs, for history and social science in the K-12 public school system. And we are part of an effort to try to increase content in the history and social science standards about Asian American communities. And so happy to chat more about that later, but that's probably our, that is our first, that's our current major topic. I feel like before I go on, I do want to address some of the questions that have come up in the chat. Do you find hostilities among the people we deal with? Yes and no. I think they play out in lots of different ways, right? So, for example, there may be hostility between being Korean Americans and Japanese Americans, right? Because of Japanese imperialism of Korea. Or say, right now, not right now, but even between India and Pakistan, right? And some of that has played out in some really very visible ways. For one example is the former Secretary of Education in Virginia Atif Karni is Pakistani American. And there were sometimes various Indian Americans who accused him of doing certain things because he had a vendetta against Indian Americans. I mean, Are there hostilities? I'm sure there will be, right? When people immigrate to this country, it's not like they come and then they like totally forget like the history of their motherlands, or, are there hostilities among different immigrants from Europe? Yes, right? So, I mean, you would expect that same dynamic to play out here. But how it plays out, I think, is very different. I mean, one kind of joking thing is that my parents-in-law, I married a Korean American, my parents-in-law refused to buy any goods made by Japanese companies, even if they're actually very high quality, just because they're Japanese. So yes, the answer is yes, but I don't think that's specific to Asian Americans. You see that, I think, across the board. Like, even I'm from Philadelphia. People from Philadelphia hate people from Texas because of football. I don't know, Philadelphia Eagles versus the Dallas Cowboys. I don't understand it, but whatever. There's hostility. Who is doing the best overall research and analysis of these matters? That's a very loaded question. I would say in Virginia, it's us. Just, I don't know. I mean, you've got lots of different, I mean, not lots, but there are different organizations doing different types of work. So I think, I don't know, I don't really understand. I think I need to understand more to answer your question. How big of a gang problem is there in the Asian American community? That's interesting, right? Like for example, like I've also hear about gang violence in Centerville as well. I don't really know. I mean, the Asian Americans that we work with, when we ask and we talk to thousands of Asian Americans every year, whether it's door-to-door canvassing, phone banking, folks coming to our community meetings. I mean, we do a lot of conversations and listening to Asian Americans. I would say less than 0.1% of people, like if you ask them what are the major issues in our community, ever bring up gangs. So I'm really curious for the person who brought this up. If you don't mind emailing me afterwards, like if you have time, like why you bring this up, because I have literally never heard this. And I have personally talked to thousands of voters over the 5.5 years that I've worked at Hamkae Center. There's another question. Are the new folks coming from Sri Lanka? I don't know, maybe. I don't know that level of detail. Are there current immigration issues that the Asian community is dealing with at this time? I mean, it's so for us, it's being undocumented. So that's why we have worked for many years for a path to citizenship. Another big issue tends to be around family unity. So people are waiting for whether USCIS is just understaffed or there just aren't enough visas that are allocated. But sometimes people can wait years to be reunited with family members. And another one that comes up is around detention and deportation. So those are current immigration issues. Does religion impact anything? Oh, yeah. I mean, doesn't religion impact everything for everybody, not just Asian Americans? So yes. In fact, this is kind of one of the reasons why, like, at least for us, we consider ourselves a pan-AAPI group, but doing work in South Asian American communities has been particularly difficult, right? Because you could be Indian, right? Like, or, but it's going to be like where you worship, where you shop, can be really different based on what your religion is. So it's definitely, there are, in the Korean American community, you have your Christians, you have your Buddhists, right? So religion does impact. I mean, the answer to this would be, the simple answer is yes. And I could go on and on about how it does. Okay, I've only got a few more slides, so I'll zip through these. Here are just some photos of us doing our organizing and advocacy in action. Okay, we also do nonpartisan civic engagement, so voter registration. And actually, we don't do as much voter registration. That's very hard in Virginia. But voter education, poll monitoring, exit polling, talking to voters. So services and outreach. In particular, we support folks applying to become citizens. I would love if any of you are immigration lawyers, retired immigration lawyers, and you ever want to volunteer, or you know an immigration lawyer that might want to volunteer with us to support our citizenship work, please email me. We are always looking for more volunteers in this area. And earlier this year and last year, we partnered with Fairfax County to do vaccine clinics. And lastly is leadership development. And so just some photos there. Okay, so I'm at the end here. So here's my contact information. If there's, again, anything I brought up today that you'd like to talk more about, please feel free to contact me either by email or by phone. If you do email, and I mean, if you do social media, I really don't like social media that much, but here is our social media handles and you can follow us. And thank you all for being so obviously attentive based on all that activity that was in the chat. So thank you for inviting me here today.
And we have one more kind of an expansion of the question about violence in the chat. She said she brought it up because you were talking about violence against Asian Americans, and on the news we hear about violence against Asian Americans at the Eden Center.
Okay, well, that's always something we'll keep in mind. I mean, certainly the Eden Center is so interesting because it's potentially going through some redevelopment. So there are a number of us that are concerned that redevelopment might mean the displacement of some businesses and folks who live in Falls Church, because sometimes redevelopment means often means higher rents.